June 7, 1944. Dawn creeps across the beaches of Normandy. The air still reeks of cordite and salt, the surf stained a faint red from the day before. Between the twisted iron of landing craft and shattered helmets, a single medic crawls through the wet sand, clutching a small canvas satchel marked with a red cross. His hands shake, not from fear but from exhaustion. Inside the bag, morphine syrets, sulfa powder, a rubber tourniquet, and a bottle of plasma that could mean the difference between life and death. Around him, men cry out for help, some whispering, some silent forever. There is no time to think, only to move. He kneels beside a wounded soldier, clamps an artery, injects morphine, and sprinkles sulfa into an open wound before dragging the man toward the tide where stretcher-bearers wait. Each second stolen from death feels like defiance itself. In that chaos, amid bullets and blood, the medic's discipline replaces panic. His training becomes survival. Across the world, thousands of others are fighting the same invisible race, not against an enemy army, but against time, shock, and infection. The battlefield has changed, but medicine is learning to move with it. At the outbreak of the Second World War in September 1939, armies across Europe marched forward with modern tanks, aircraft, and radios. Yet their approach to saving the wounded had changed little since the muddy horror of 1918. The lessons of the Great War had been written in blood, but much of that knowledge was scattered, forgotten, or slow to reach the next generation. When soldiers fell on the battlefields of Poland, Finland, and later France, the chain of survival was fragile, often broken by distance and time. Field medicine still depended on horse-drawn ambulances in some regions, while infection, shock, and uncontrolled bleeding remained the three silent killers no bullet could match. In most armies, the time between injury and surgery could stretch to 12 hours or more, long enough for gangrene to set in, long enough for life to slip quietly away. In 1939, medical doctrine was built on a system of evacuation rather than immediate intervention. The wounded were pulled from the front lines by stretcher-bearers and sent backward, first to a regimental aid post, then to a dressing station, and finally to a field or general hospital miles away. Each step meant delay. Each delay cost lives. Military planners still viewed medical support as a service behind the battle rather than within it. The focus was on clearing casualties from the battlefield, not necessarily saving them there. Shock, the body's collapse after massive trauma, was poorly understood. Hemorrhage was treated with bandages and prayer. The idea of giving blood transfusions on the battlefield was almost unthinkable to many commanders. The British Army entered the war with a system shaped by its colonial experiences, capable but slow to adapt to mechanized warfare. The Royal Army Medical Corps, RAMC, operated an intricate hierarchy of aid posts, casualty clearing stations, and base hospitals stretching far behind the front. It was efficient in theory, but in practice, the sheer mobility of modern warfare left it struggling to keep pace. The German Wehrmacht, meanwhile, fielded a highly organized Sanitätsdienst, supported by Red Cross units and motorized ambulances, yet it too depended on distance. Evacuating casualties to rear hospitals for definitive surgery, Soviet forces faced even grimmer realities. Vast distances, primitive transport, and few trained surgeons at the front. Their medical trains and field hospitals were heroic efforts held together by endurance more than resources. In the early campaigns, Poland in 1939, France and the Low Countries in 1940, and the initial clashes in North Africa, the medical services of all nations confronted the brutal truth. Speed now killed, and only speed could save. A single bullet from a high-velocity rifle could shatter bone beyond repair. Artillery shell fragments caused catastrophic wounds filled with dirt and bacteria. Burns from exploding fuel tanks and chemical weapons left soldiers unrecognizable. Yet even as weapons evolved, the tools of survival lagged behind. Morphine was available but limited. Antibiotics like penicillin were still experimental and scarce. Most soldiers carried small tins of sulfonamide powder, a chemical cousin of penicillin, but its effectiveness depended on how and when it was applied. For many, it arrived too late. The early years of the war were also marked by logistical chaos. In France in 1940, retreating Allied forces left behind entire hospital trains. Surgeons worked under bombardment, performing amputations in farmhouses and barns. The evacuation routes were clogged with refugees and broken vehicles. In the Soviet Union, medical personnel often carried their wounded by sled through snow and mud. In North Africa, men bled to death in the open desert, where medics fought sandstorms and dehydration as fiercely as the enemy. Across every front, the same phrase echoed in field reports: delay fatal. By 1941, the grim arithmetic was undeniable. Roughly 1 out of every 3 soldiers who reached a field hospital alive still died of wounds. Those with abdominal injuries faced nearly certain death. Infection spread faster than treatment could arrive. It became clear that saving lives required a complete rethinking of how armies fought and healed. The concept of medicine in the rear had to end. Care needed to move forward, closer to the front, faster to the wound, nearer to the edge of chaos itself. That realization, born out of staggering losses, set the stage for the most radical transformation in battlefield medicine in modern history. The coming years would see new technologies, new doctrines, and new heroes emerge, from mobile surgical hospitals in the Mediterranean to the first airborne evacuations in Burma and New Guinea. But in 1939 and 1940, such ideas were still distant dreams. The world was only beginning to understand that victory would depend not just on how many men an army could send into battle, but on how many it could bring back alive. By 1942, the war had stretched across continents, and medicine was forced to evolve with it. What began as desperate improvisation on the battlefields of Europe slowly transformed into a systematic revolution in combat care. The key realization was simple but profound. The closer medical treatment could get to the point of injury, the more lives could be saved. Armies across the Allied and Axis fronts began shifting doctrine, pushing surgery forward rather than pulling casualties back. The old chain of evacuation, from the front line to the rear, began to reverse itself. Forward surgery, as it came to be known, would change everything. In North Africa, the British 8th Army and its medical services faced the perfect testing ground. The desert was vast, harsh, and unforgiving. Casualties could lie for hours under the blazing sun before being reached. Ambulances often had to drive for miles through open terrain exposed to enemy aircraft. In this crucible, British and Commonwealth doctors reimagined mobility itself. They set up casualty clearing stations, CCS, and field surgical units close to the fighting, sometimes within earshot of artillery, to perform immediate operations on abdominal and chest wounds. Under the direction of surgeons like Sir Archibald Macindoe and later Colonel Edward D. Churchill of the U.S. Army, new standards of triage and surgical urgency were defined. Golden hours, though not yet named as such, were recognized in practice. The sooner a wound was cleaned, a limb amputated, or a hemorrhage stopped, the better the odds of survival. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States was mobilizing not just armies, but an entire medical-industrial complex. The Surgeon General's office coordinated with the Red Cross, civilian hospitals, and universities to build an enormous network for blood and plasma collection. In 1940, Charles Drew, a pioneering African-American physician, developed methods for large-scale plasma preservation and storage, solving one of medicine's oldest problems: how to deliver life itself in a bottle. Plasma could be dried, reconstituted, and shipped by the crate. It became the backbone of battlefield resuscitation. By 1943, plasma transfusion was as essential to a soldier's survival kit as his rifle. The introduction of sulfa drugs, sulfonamides, brought another vital leap forward. Issued in small tins to every Allied soldier, these white powders were poured directly into open wounds to fight infection. They were not perfect, but they worked well enough to buy time. Soldiers were trained to use them immediately after injury, creating the first standardized form of self-aid and buddy aid on the battlefield. For the first time, ordinary infantrymen became the first link in their own survival chain. Medics, too, became specialists in rapid intervention, trained to identify shock, control bleeding, and administer morphine with precision. In 1943, something even greater arrived: penicillin. Discovered years earlier by Alexander Fleming, its mass production only became possible through joint British-American efforts during the war. Factories in the United States, particularly in Illinois and New York, began producing the drug on an industrial scale. By the time of the D-Day landings in 1944, penicillin was being used widely across Allied forces, drastically reducing infection rates and amputations. For the first time in military history, a deep wound was no longer a guaranteed death sentence. The collaboration between science, industry, and the military was unprecedented. Universities, pharmaceutical companies, and the armed forces united by the singular goal of defeating infection faster than it could spread. The U.S. Army Medical Department, learning from both the British in North Africa and their own experiences in the Pacific, reorganized itself around speed and flexibility. The chain of care now began at the battalion aid station, where medics stabilized the wounded under fire. From there, casualties moved by jeep or litter to collecting stations, then to clearing stations where surgeons performed emergency operations. Portable surgical hospitals, forerunners of the famous MASH units, appeared across Italy and the Pacific Islands, operating under tents and palm trees. The system's efficiency was astonishing. Within 4 to 6 hours of injury, a soldier could receive major surgery, plasma, and antibiotics, something unimaginable just 3 years earlier. Elsewhere in the Soviet Union, similar principles took shape under conditions of unrelenting hardship. Soviet doctors, often women, established frontline surgical brigades capable of operating under bombardment and extreme cold. Blood transfusion services were organized on a massive scale, with thousands of liters stored and distributed across the Eastern Front. In Germany, field hospitals worked with discipline and ingenuity. But by 1944, shortages of drugs, blood, and fuel eroded their capacity. Even so, German medics pioneered rapid evacuation by motorized ambulance and aircraft, innovations mirrored by the Allies. By 1943, the face of battlefield medicine had changed. Air evacuation, first tested in the deserts of North Africa, became routine. Transport planes fitted with stretcher racks carried thousands of wounded from Sicily, Normandy, and the Pacific back to base hospitals in hours instead of days. Nurses, once confined to rear hospitals, now served aboard aircraft and hospital ships, becoming vital professionals in the chain of survival. The entire architecture of war medicine had shifted. The battlefield was no longer just a place of destruction. It was becoming a place of rescue. The medic's bag was now as vital as a rifle, and the war's outcome was measured not only in victories won, but in lives reclaimed from the brink. The next stage of this evolution would not be about innovation or doctrine alone. It would be tested in the fire of the greatest invasion of the century. Every war tests not only the strength of armies, but the endurance of those who saved them. By 1944, the face of battlefield medicine had been reshaped by countless acts of courage and necessity. Yet, behind every doctrine and every surgical breakthrough stood the human being, the medic, the surgeon, the nurse, the stretcher-bearer, working within minutes of chaos. The war's medical revolution wasn't born in laboratories alone. It was carried out by trembling hands in mud, sand, and blood. These were the angles of survival, The human, the tactical, the scientific, and the moral that together redefined what it meant to fight death itself. The human edge was where it all began. The combat medic became the unsung hero of the modern battlefield. Stripped of a weapon and armed only with a red cross, he crawled through bullets to reach the fallen. His task was measured in seconds. Stop the bleeding, clear the airway, give morphine, prevent shock. The U.S. Army's training manuals turned these actions into ritual, simple, repeatable steps that could mean the difference between life and death. But nothing could train the heart for what came after. At Anzio, Normandy, and Peleliu, medics treated friends while shells fell around them, sometimes performing surgery by flashlight in craters filled with rainwater. Many died in the act of saving others. Their bravery was often unrecorded, their names lost in reports labeled "killed in action." Yet their impact rippled through history. On the other side of the lines, German sanitator and Soviet medics performed the same desperate work, proving that humanity, even in total war, could still flicker in the smallest gestures: a bandage, a pulse, a whisper of hope. Yet courage alone could not overcome the tyranny of distance. The next crucial factor was the tactical clock, the merciless measure of how long it took to reach a wounded man before his body gave up. The realization was simple but brutal. Time killed more soldiers than bullets. The Allies learned this lesson in the deserts of North Africa and the jungles of the Pacific. Doctors began mapping the geography of survival, calculating routes from the front line to the nearest surgical post. Forward medical units were placed closer to battle than ever before, sometimes just a few hundred yards behind the assault. Engineers built roads and cleared lanes specifically for ambulances. Smoke screens were laid to cover casualty evacuation. At Monte Cassino, medics used armored carriers and jeeps converted into mobile ambulances to pull men from fire zones. Each step forward in reducing evacuation time translated directly into more lives saved. The once static hospital became a moving organism, flexible and quick. This doctrine, care as close as possible to the fight, would become the blueprint for modern trauma response decades later. The third pillar of survival was blood and shock, understanding and defeating the body's collapse after injury. Before the war, shock was a mystery that often ended in death. Surgeons spoke of circulatory failure, but had no clear way to reverse it. Then came plasma and whole blood. Plasma, separated from red cells, could be stored longer and shipped worldwide. Whole blood, though more perishable, gave life in a way nothing else could. Both became the lifeline of the front. The British pioneered plasma transfusion at El Alamein, saving countless soldiers from the brink of death. In the U.S., vast civilian drives collected blood for Our Boys Overseas. The famous Blood for Britain campaign in 1940 was only the beginning. By 1944, tens of thousands of pints were flown into active combat zones. Medics learned to recognize the waxy face and rapid pulse of hemorrhagic shock, reaching for plasma bottles even before bandages. Makeshift transfusion rigs appeared in trenches and trucks, with tubing hanging from rifle racks. A wounded soldier could receive a transfusion within minutes of being pulled from battle. A miracle of logistics and science intertwined. Shock, once a sentence, became a challenge, and often a victory. Then there was infection control, the unseen war that decided whether a man would live beyond his wounds. For centuries, infection had been the soldier's deadliest enemy. Even minor wounds could fester into gangrene and death. In World War II, that ancient killer met its match. The widespread use of sulfa drugs gave soldiers their first line of chemical defense. Issued in small tins labeled First Aid Dressing, U.S. Army, sulfa powder was sprinkled into open wounds by soldiers themselves. The routine was drilled into every recruit. Stop the bleeding, apply sulfa. Bandage tight. It was crude but effective. Mortality from infected wounds dropped dramatically. But the true revolution came with penicillin. Though Alexander Fleming discovered it in 1928, it was during the war that penicillin became a weapon. Factories in the United States, Pfizer among them, perfected deep fermentation techniques, producing enough of the antibiotic to treat every Allied soldier wounded in Europe. Its impact was immediate and staggering. Wound infections that once required amputations could now be cured. Hospitals saw a drop in septicemia deaths from nearly 20% to less than 1%. Surgeons who once fought infection with amputation now fought to save limbs. For the first time, medicine wasn't just repairing the body, it was preserving it. Behind these medical triumphs lay a new understanding of organization and leadership, the doctrine of survival. Commanders began to see that medicine was not a passive service, but an active weapon of war. Men like Colonel Edward D. Churchill in the Mediterranean and Brigadier Hugh Cairns in Britain argued that a soldier's survival was a logistical victory as vital as ammunition or fuel. They established principles still followed today. Triage by urgency, not rank. Surgery forward, not rear. And teamwork between medics, nurses, and surgeons as a unified combat system. These leaders institutionalized what the war had taught in blood, that a saved life was not just a mercy, but a strategic resource. Through these human and tactical revolutions, World War II became not only a battle for territory, but a battle for time itself. Every stretcher carried from the mud, every plasma bottle hanging in a tent, every nurse whispering encouragement under fire, told the same story, that even in humanity's darkest hours, compassion and precision could triumph over chaos. These were the quiet victories that history seldom recorded, but upon which the modern art of saving lives was built. As 1944 approached, all these elements, courage, speed, blood, and science, converged toward a single moment of ultimate testing. On the shores of Normandy, the greatest invasion in history would not only decide the fate of Europe, but would also determine whether this new system of battlefield medicine could withstand its most brutal trial. Yet, by the middle of 1944, the war had revealed that medicine, like strategy, depended on leadership. The great transformation of battlefield survival wasn't achieved by chance, it was driven by commanders and surgeons who refused to accept unnecessary loss. This was the leadership and doctrine angle, where innovation met command responsibility. Men such as Colonel Edward D. Churchill of the U.S. Army and Brigadier Hugh Cairns in the British forces understood that surgery could no longer be confined to the rear. They pushed for the concept of forward surgery, small, mobile teams capable of performing life-saving operations within hours of wounding. Their reports from North Africa and Sicily circulated widely through Allied command structures, turning what began as field improvisation into official doctrine. The phrase, definitive surgery near the front, became a mantra repeated in medical briefings and field manuals. For Churchill, time was the decisive factor. He believed that a man who reached surgery within 6 hours of being wounded had twice the chance of survival compared to one who waited 12. His data proved prophetic. By 1944, Allied armies institutionalized mobile surgical units, complete with sterilization equipment, blood plasma, and tents that could be raised in an hour. Surgery, once a luxury of fixed hospitals, had become a frontline operation. Leadership extended beyond surgery. It required coordination between logistics officers, transportation units, and frontline medics. Every casualty meant a chain of movement, jeeps, trucks, trains, and aircraft, all synchronized like gears in a machine. Commanders who valued medical logistics discovered that they preserved not just lives, but morale. In the Italian campaign, for instance, General Mark Clark's decision to prioritize casualty evacuation during the Anzio landings prevented a collapse in troop confidence. Soldiers who knew they could be rescued fought harder and longer. Medicine had become not only a service, but a force multiplier. By contrast, armies that failed to adapt paid a heavy price. The Axis powers, particularly Germany and Japan, suffered from shortages of medical supplies, limited blood resources, and overburdened field hospitals by 1944. Their soldiers were often left to die where they fell, not for lack of courage, but for lack of a system. The second perspective in this phase of the war came from the enemy and Eastern Front reality, the unforgiving scale of medical warfare beyond the Western narrative. On the vast plains of Russia, millions of casualties turned medicine into an operation of endurance. The Soviet Union's sanitary services faced unimaginable conditions: freezing winters, collapsing infrastructure, and relentless bombardment. Yet amid this suffering, Soviet doctors performed feats of resilience that astonished even their Western allies. Field surgery was conducted in unheated huts, sometimes by candlelight. Women, surgeons, nurses, and stretcher-bearers made up a significant part of the Soviet medical corps, working under fire as shells shook the walls around them. They pioneered improvised field blood transfusions using locally stored plasma and organized mobile surgical brigades that mirrored Western innovations. Despite primitive conditions, their survival rates improved throughout the war, proving that doctrine alone could not define success. It required unbreakable human spirit. The German Medical Corps, though highly trained and disciplined, began to collapse under the sheer weight of attrition. In the early years, the Wehrmacht's Sanitätsdienst had set the standard for organization and efficiency. Field hospitals, evacuation trains, and medical aircraft worked seamlessly during the Blitzkrieg campaigns. But as the war dragged into its final years, shortages of fuel, antibiotics, and even bandages crippled the system. The Eastern Front, with its endless distances and brutal climate, devoured men and medicine alike. German field surgeons often operated without anesthesia, using rags soaked in schnapps for pain relief. Evacuation by horse cart became common again by 1945, a grim regression in the face of total collapse. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe's medical air service, once a symbol of efficiency, was grounded for lack of aircraft. Even the most skilled doctors could not heal a dying army. And yet, through this panorama of suffering, another question emerged, one that transcended sides and statistics. This was the ethical and humanitarian angle, the quiet conflict fought behind every stretcher and Red Cross emblem. The Geneva Conventions had promised protection for medical personnel, but on modern battlefields, those rules often dissolved under fire. Medics on both sides were targeted, their armbands seen through scopes rather than spared. Reports from North Africa, Italy, and Normandy tell of snipers aiming deliberately at medics marked with red crosses on their helmets. The moral dilemma was unbearable: to serve unarmed among the armed, to save the enemy when possible, to face death while carrying no weapon but compassion. Still, many did. There are accounts of American and German medics working side by side in neutralized zones, tending to the wounded of both armies until one side advanced again. War exposed the fragility of human morality, but also its endurance. The Red Cross itself became both a symbol and a shield. Hospital ships, painted white and lit through the night, ferried thousands of wounded across the Mediterranean. Yet even these were sometimes attacked, accidentally or deliberately. The sinking of the AHS Centaur in 1943 by a Japanese submarine, despite its clear markings, shocked the world and ignited outrage. It reminded humanity that compassion had no guaranteed sanctuary in total war. Still, the emblem endured, and so did the principle it represented, that even in mechanized slaughter, mercy must have its place. By the end of 1944, these intertwined angles, leadership, endurance, and ethics, had formed the backbone of a new kind of warfare, one where saving life was as organized and strategic as taking it. Across every front, armies were learning the same truth, that victory was hollow if it left only the dead behind. The war's medical system, refined by fire and suffering, now stood ready for its ultimate test: the beaches of Normandy, where hundreds of thousands would be wounded in a single day. There, the theories of forward surgery, rapid evacuation, And battlefield ethics would collide with the chaos of the largest invasion in human history. June 6, 1944. Dawn broke over the English Channel beneath low clouds and gunfire. Operation Overlord, the greatest amphibious invasion ever attempted, was underway. For the medics who would wade ashore that morning, D-Day was not simply a military operation, it was the ultimate test of everything learned about saving lives under fire. The Allied medical system, refined across 5 years of war, faced its moment of truth. From the decks of landing craft to the sands of Normandy, the race against death began anew, this time on a scale that no one could have fully prepared for. On the beaches codenamed Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword, the first waves of soldiers were cut down in the surf. Machine gun fire from German bunkers tore through men before they reached dry sand. Amid the chaos, medics leapt from landing craft carrying canvas satchels marked with red crosses. Their only protection, the hope that the symbol would be respected. Many were killed within minutes of landing. Those who survived began their grim work immediately, crawling from body to body through seawater and shrapnel, checking pulses, applying tourniquets, injecting morphine, and sprinkling sulfa powder into open wounds. There was no organized front line, only survival zones carved from terror. A single medic could treat dozens of men in the span of an hour, his hands trembling from exhaustion and shock. Every move was instinctive, rehearsed through training but now made real in blood and sand. Behind the front, medical planners had constructed a massive support network that stretched across the channel. Hospital ships, floating surgical theaters equipped with plasma and penicillin, waited offshore. Landing ship tanks, LSTs, were converted into mobile treatment wards. Nurses and orderlies prepared to receive the first waves of casualties. On the beaches, field surgeons, often working under shell fire, set up advanced dressing stations inside bomb craters or half-destroyed bunkers. Plasma bottles hung from the rafters of shattered houses. Morphine was rationed, bandages ran out, and seawater served for cleaning wounds when supplies failed. Men with abdominal injuries, once considered hopeless cases, were stabilized long enough to be evacuated by boat or amphibious truck. For the first time, the chain of survival functioned across sea, sand, and sky as a single continuous artery. In the days leading up to D-Day, Allied medical officers had rehearsed the evacuation chain in secret. Each division carried its own complement of aidmen and surgeons. Each beach had pre-designated evacuation routes marked by colored flags. Yet even the most detailed plans unraveled under the weight of reality. On Omaha, rising tides swallowed supply crates and stretchers. Casualty collection points were destroyed by artillery. Medics improvised, turning life jackets into slings, using rifles as splints, and sheltering the wounded behind burning vehicles. Still, discipline held. The principle of triage, treat the salvageable first, guided every decision. It was harsh, merciless even, but necessary. Those 2 gravely wounded were given morphine and comfort. Those with hope were dragged to safety. By mid-morning, casualty clearing points began to form at the water's edge, guarded by small teams of medics working knee-deep in tidewater. They called it surgery in the surf. As the day wore on, the system began to stabilize. Engineers cleared beach exits, ambulances rolled off landing craft, and the wounded were carried to collecting points just beyond the dunes. Here, medical officers performed field surgery amid the roar of artillery. Shrapnel was removed with bayonets sterilized in boiling water, wounds were packed with sulfa, and plasma bottles dripped steadily beside patients lying on stretchers laid over sandbags. Every drop of plasma represented an hour of life. Every injection of penicillin was a triumph of logistics as much as science. The constant danger was not only gunfire, but drowning. Rising tides threatened to reclaim the wounded before they could be moved. Throughout the day, the coordination between sea and land became the war's first large-scale test of integrated evacuation. Navy crews ferried the wounded from beach to ship under fire, sometimes loading stretchers while shells splashed around them. Nurses aboard hospital ships recorded thousands of casualties by midnight. On the British beaches, Royal Army Medical Corps units set up tent hospitals within a mile of the front, performing operations under blackout conditions. At Utah Beach, U.S. medics established a working surgical line by afternoon. They triaged, transfused, and treated without pause, sometimes operating for 20 hours straight. Every minute counted, the tactical clock still ruled all. By nightfall, the beaches were littered with bandages, plasma bottles, and stretchers. The wounded who could walk did so leaning on one another. Those who could not were lined in rows waiting for evacuation. Yet amid the devastation, a quiet order began to emerge. Reports sent back to the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHIEF, described not chaos, but resilience. Casualty evacuation times were shorter than expected. The use of forward surgical teams and plasma transfusions had cut mortality rates dramatically compared to earlier campaigns. Though the losses were horrific, thousands dead and many more wounded, the system had worked. The doctrine forged in North Africa and refined in Italy had held under the most brutal conditions imaginable. As the fires burned across Normandy, the men and women of the Allied medical services worked through the night. In field tents illuminated by flickering lamps, surgeons operated without rest. Outside, orderlies moved silently among rows of stretchers, checking pulses, whispering reassurance. The air smelled of blood, iodine, and seawater. Every sound, the clink of instruments, the hiss of morphine syringes, the distant rumble of guns, was part of a rhythm that would define the next phase of the war. The beaches had become hospitals, and the front line itself had become the operating room of modern medicine. For those who survived D-Day, the meaning was unmistakable. The race against death had been won, not by miracle but by preparation, courage, and science. Yet the battle for life was far from over. As the Allies pushed inland through the hedgerows of Normandy, their field hospitals would face even greater challenges: mass casualties, infections, exhaustion, and the relentless demands of a war that still had months to go. As darkness fell on June 6, 1944, the beaches of Normandy transformed into a vast open-air hospital. The sound of waves mingled with groans of the wounded, and the night sky flickered with the glow of burning ships and tracer fire. The invasion had succeeded in establishing a foothold, but the human cost was staggering. By midnight, more than 10,000 Allied soldiers lay dead or injured. For the men of the medical corps, sleep was a forgotten luxury. They worked through the night, guided by flashlights, cigarette embers, and instinct. In the flickering half-light, the true test of modern battlefield medicine began, not on strategy maps or radio briefings, but at the edge of life itself. Inside makeshift aid stations, surgeons performed operations shoulder to shoulder. Blood pooled beneath their boots as they amputated shattered limbs, stitched arteries, and packed wounds with sulfa. The smell of antiseptic mixed with gunpowder and the salt of the sea. Outside, orderlies ferried the wounded on stretchers made from doors, fence rails, and fragments of landing craft. Every resource was stretched to breaking point. Morphine supplies dwindled. Plasma bottles emptied faster than they could be replaced, and medical tents overflowed. Yet the system held. The principles hammered into every medic since North Africa, speed, triage, and coordination, were paying off. Penicillin, newly available in mass quantities, became the silent hero of the night. Ampoules of the drug were passed from one surgeon to another, each dose a lifeline against infection. In previous wars, men who survived surgery often died days later from sepsis. Now, for the first time, survival meant true recovery. Field hospitals reported infection rates dropping below 5%, an unthinkable figure just a few years earlier. Surgeons who had once performed amputations as routine now dared to attempt limb-saving repairs. The human body, given time and care, could heal itself, and modern medicine was finally fast enough to make that time possible. By dawn on June 7th, the evacuation chain was fully operational. Ambulances rumbled down cleared causeways, carrying the wounded to waiting LSTs. Navy crews worked around the clock, transforming their vessels into floating wards. Plasma hung from overhead rails, morphine syringes lined trays beside maps and compasses. The sea, which had delivered death only hours before, now carried hope. Hospital ships, painted white and marked with great red crosses, glowed like lanterns against the morning mist. Inside them, nurses moved quietly between bunks, checking bandages and taking pulses. The hum of generators replaced the sound of battle. Some soldiers, barely conscious, whispered their thanks before slipping into sleep, alive only because medicine had learned to move as swiftly as war itself. Inland, the work grew even harder. The Bocage country, Normandy's dense maze of hedgerows and narrow lanes, turned evacuation into an ordeal. Stretcher teams struggled through mud and barbed wire, often under sniper fire. Jeeps fitted with stretchers bounced along improvised trails, carrying men whose lives depended on the stability of a driver's hands. Forward surgical teams leapfrogged behind the advancing infantry, setting up wherever there was cover, barns, churches, even bomb craters. The rhythm was unrelenting: stabilize, operate, evacuate. Casualties came in faster than they could be cleared, but the doctrine of continuous movement, medicine in motion, kept the chain intact. Reports from Normandy described scenes both harrowing and miraculous. At Omaha Beach, a field surgeon operated for 22 straight hours, saving dozens of lives before collapsing from exhaustion. In one British sector, an entire surgical team worked inside a wrecked farmhouse, sterilizing their instruments in a fireplace. American nurses, who had landed just days after the assault, were thrust immediately into the front lines. Their presence was transformative. Calm, steady, and fearless, they worked side by side with surgeons, sometimes under shell fire, bringing a sense of humanity back to a world consumed by destruction. The Angels of Normandy, as soldiers called them, became living proof that compassion could coexist with war. The statistics that followed in the weeks after D-Day were nothing short of revolutionary. Of the tens of thousands wounded during the Normandy campaign, nearly 90% who reached a surgical post alive would survive. This was the triumph of organization, science, and courage over the chaos of modern battle. Compared to the Great War, where infections and delays had claimed countless lives, the contrast was staggering. The concept of the golden hour was now fully realized in practice, though not yet named as such. Soldiers were receiving blood, plasma, and antibiotics within minutes of injury. The difference between life and death was no longer luck, but logistics. As the Allied armies advanced deeper into France, the system followed seamlessly. Evacuation hospitals were established in captured towns, while air evacuation, using C-47 Dakotas fitted with stretcher racks, became standard procedure. In just 1 week, over 10,000 wounded were flown from Normandy to England. The wounded were no longer lost in the fog of war. They were traced, treated, and transported with military precision. Each success carried lessons that would shape not only the remainder of the war, but the entire future of emergency medicine. Still, victory came at a cost. The doctors and medics who performed these miracles paid their own quiet price, weeks without sleep, minds scarred by the faces they couldn't save. For every triumph recorded in reports, there were moments of silence for those who slipped away despite every effort. Yet even those losses carried meaning. Every death analyzed, every failure studied, became part of the evolving doctrine that pushed medicine forward. The battlefield had become a laboratory, not of theory, but of human endurance. By the end of June 1944, The Allied Medical Service had achieved what once seemed impossible. It had tamed the chaos of mass warfare through discipline, compassion, and science. The beaches of Normandy stood as both graveyard and testament, a place where destruction and healing existed side by side. The race against death had reached its climax, and for once humanity had won. But, as the war pressed on toward Paris, the Ardennes, and eventually Germany itself, new challenges awaited: disease, exhaustion, and the mental wounds that no bandage could heal. The work of saving lives was far from finished. When the beaches of Normandy finally quieted and the front pushed inland, the full scope of what had been achieved began to emerge. In the weeks following the D-Day landings, Allied medical units processed more than 40,000 casualties from France alone. Yet, for the first time in modern warfare, the majority of those wounded survived. Reports flowing back to London and Washington painted a portrait of extraordinary success. Infections were down to single digits. Evacuation times were measured in hours rather than days. And battlefield surgery had evolved from a desperate gamble into a disciplined science. The numbers spoke for themselves. Where the Great War had claimed nearly 1 in 3 wounded soldiers even after they reached a hospital, by 1944 the figure had dropped to 1 in 50. Behind every statistic lay thousands of lives pulled back from the brink, and a system that had proven its worth beyond doubt. From the hedgerows of Normandy to the mountains of Italy, the same pattern repeated itself. The Allied medical network, stretched across continents, had achieved a degree of coordination that no army in history had ever matched. Each phase of care, aid station, field hospital, evacuation unit, general hospital, functioned like a living organism. Communication flowed through radio and dispatch. Surgeons logged case data by hand that would later inform medical doctrine for decades to come. The chain of survival was now a chain of command. Military planners, once skeptical of investing resources in medical logistics, came to see that every wounded man returned to duty was a reinforcement more valuable than any weapon. The idea that saving lives was not separate from victory, but part of it had finally taken root. In Italy, the hard lessons learned from Anzio and Salerno came full circle. At the Anzio beachhead, forward surgical hospitals had operated for months under continuous shell fire. They were shelled so frequently that many doctors performed operations in underground shelters. Yet their work was astonishingly effective. Casualty survival rates exceeded 80% despite relentless bombardment. The principles of early resuscitation, rapid surgery, and staged evacuation had become second nature. In Burma and New Guinea, far from Europe's battlefields, Allied medical units applied these same doctrines with equal success. Air evacuation became the norm. Casualties who once would have perished in jungle heat or disease-ridden swamps were lifted by Dakota aircraft within hours to base hospitals hundreds of miles away. Blood and plasma, once the privilege of European fronts, reached even these distant theaters, flown in metal containers cooled by dry ice. Medicine had become mobile, global, and relentless. Nowhere was the success more visible than in the Pacific, where island warfare presented its own form of cruelty. At Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, casualty rates were extreme, but so was the efficiency of the American medical corps. Portable surgical hospitals, predecessors to the famous MASH units of later wars, moved with the Marines, setting up within hours of landings. Surgeons worked in tropical rain, surrounded by the constant hum of flies and the whine of artillery, yet their results were remarkable. The introduction of whole blood transfusions in the field reduced shock deaths by nearly half. Forward surgical teams carried not only penicillin, but refrigerated blood plasma, an innovation that allowed operations once thought impossible in combat zones. By 1945, air evacuation networks connected Pacific Islands to major bases in Guam, Saipan, and Hawaii. Soldiers wounded in Okinawa could be receiving advanced surgery in Pearl Harbor, within 48 hours. For the first time in history, global warfare had a truly global medical system. Amid the triumphs, the psychological burden on medical personnel deepened. The doctors, nurses, and stretcher-bearers had become masters of organization, but they were still human. Many suffered from exhaustion and trauma. Some had performed thousands of surgeries in the space of a few weeks. Others carried the memory of faces they could not save. Their work rarely made headlines, yet it was their endurance that sustained the war's momentum. The Allied armies moved forward on the strength of men and women who refused to yield, even when surrounded by suffering. By late 1944, military analysts recognized that medicine had become a decisive weapon in its own right. The ability to return men to combat, or at least to life, gave the Allies an edge the Axis could not match. German and Japanese field medical systems, overextended and undersupplied, faltered under the weight of attrition. Infection, disease, and untreated wounds decimated their ranks long after the battles ended. The Allies, by contrast, had built a medical machine that turned survival into strategy. What began as a humanitarian mission had evolved into a force of military efficiency. The race against death had been won, but it had also revealed something deeper about human resilience, that even amid the machinery of war, compassion could still be engineered into power. As 1945 dawned, the great tide of war began to ebb, leaving behind a landscape scarred not only by destruction but by transformation. Medicine had marched in step with the armies, reshaping itself from an auxiliary service into a decisive front-line weapon. Yet as the guns fell silent across Europe and the Pacific, a new and quieter battle emerged. The struggle to heal minds as well as bodies, to rebuild the broken, and to translate the lessons of chaos into systems of peace. What began as the race against death on the battlefield now became a race to redefine the future of human care itself. Across the Allied world, hospitals overflowed not only with the wounded, but with men suffering from what wartime physicians called battle fatigue. Today, it would be known as combat trauma or post-traumatic stress. In 1944 and 1945, it was barely understood. Soldiers trembled uncontrollably, fell mute, or broke down in tears after weeks of sustained fighting. For decades, such symptoms had been dismissed as weakness or cowardice. But the medical officers of World War II began to recognize something different. These men were not broken. They were overwhelmed. The U.S. Army established rest and rehabilitation centers, places where exhausted soldiers could recover before being sent back to the front. British and Canadian forces developed similar systems, treating the mind with the same urgency as the body. For the first time, war psychiatry became an organized field, laying the groundwork for modern mental health care. In the ruins of Europe, in fade, the medical lessons learned during 6 years of war began to shape a new global doctrine. Evacuation chains became the model for civilian emergency services. Blood banking, refined by military logistics, evolved into national transfusion networks. Antibiotics, once precious and reserved for soldiers, were mass-produced for public use. The mobile surgical units that had saved lives from North Africa to Okinawa inspired the creation of civilian trauma teams and, eventually, the hospital emergency departments that would define post-war medicine. Even the concept of triage, the painful art of choosing who to save first, became an essential principle in hospitals worldwide. The systems born in battle became the architecture of modern emergency care. The Allied victory also brought an ethical reckoning. The war had proven the heights of medical ingenuity, but had also exposed its darkest uses. In the ruins of Nuremberg and Tokyo, trials revealed the horrors of human experimentation carried out in the name of science. The same war that had perfected the art of saving life had also witnessed its betrayal. In response, the international community began to define boundaries that would guide medicine forever after. The Nuremberg Code, established in 1947, set the first global standards for medical ethics and human experimentation. Out of the ashes of war rose a moral compass, forged by those who had seen both the power and peril of scientific progress. For the doctors, nurses, and medics who had lived through it, peace felt almost unreal. Many returned home haunted by memory, unable to adjust to the silence after years of screaming wards and burning skies. Yet their work endured. The techniques they had pioneered, blood transfusion, forward surgery, air evacuation, antibiotic control, became the foundation of Cold War medicine and the template for humanitarian response in every conflict thereafter. When future wars broke out in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond, the ghosts of Normandy and Anzio guided the hands of new medics and surgeons. The battlefield had changed, but the race against death continued, now armed with the hard-earned wisdom of 1939 to 1945. Perhaps the greatest legacy of all was invisible, the change in how humanity valued a single life. Before World War II, battlefield death had been accepted as inevitable, even necessary. By its end, armies had learned that saving one soldier could be as decisive as killing 10. This moral shift, born not of sentiment but of science, altered the conscience of nations. The medic's Red Cross, once a fragile symbol of hope amid destruction, had become a permanent emblem of civilization's refusal to surrender to brutality. As 1945 drew to a close and soldiers returned home, they carried with them more than medals or scars. They carried the proof that compassion could be as disciplined as war itself. The lessons of battlefield medicine had rewritten the laws of survival. From the beaches of Normandy to the jungles of Burma, from the frozen steppes to the desert sands, the world had learned one immutable truth: that the greatest victory of the Second World War was not only in the defeat of tyranny, but in the triumph of life itself. When the final gunfire of the Second World War faded into silence, the world stood in the long shadow of its cost. Yet within that darkness glimmered a quiet, enduring triumph. Medicine, once a secondary instrument of war, had become one of its noblest legacies. The men and women who had fought their battles with scalpels, syringes, and stretchers had proven that courage need not be armed to be heroic. Their victory was not marked by captured cities or conquered territories, but by every heartbeat pulled back from the edge of extinction. In an age defined by destruction, they had redefined what it meant to save the world, not through domination, but through preservation. The story of World War II medicine is the story of time itself. Untold, how humanity learned to measure every second, not in bullets fired or miles gained, but in breaths restored. It was the transformation of chaos into order, of instinct into doctrine. Every principle of modern emergency care, rapid response, forward treatment, triage, blood transfusion, antibiotic control, was born from those desperate years. Out of necessity came discipline. Out of horror, compassion refined by precision. The medic on the battlefield, once a nameless figure among thousands, became a symbol of civilization's resilience. His presence on the field of war proved that even where death reigned, humanity refused to vanish. The legacy extended beyond hospitals and uniforms. It entered every ambulance that now speeds through city streets, every operating room where seconds count, every disaster zone where relief workers risk their lives to save strangers. The pulse of that legacy still beats, steady and enduring, in every modern act of rescue. It reminds us that progress is not merely invention, it is empathy systematized, organized, and made unbreakable. In the end, the race against death never truly ended. It continues in every crisis, every emergency, every human struggle where time and mercy collide. But thanks to those who lived and bled on the battlefields of 1939 to 1945, the world learned how to run that race, not with fear, but with purpose. Their legacy was not the perfection of war, but the perfection of care. And from that perfection came perhaps the most profound victory of all: The realization that saving a single life, even amid the ruin of millions, is the truest measure of humanity's strength.